thank you for talking with us today. This is actually your second time on the show.
Right.
You were with us in the very first season with your Punch and Judy act. Could you talk a little bit about your magic side?
Sure. I've liked magic ever since I was a kid, and I grew up watching who was it? The Mark Wilson show, The Magic Land of Alakazam. I watched that as a kid. But actually, one of the first magicians I saw was Milburn Christopher, who was actually from Baltimore, but he was performing on the Jackie Gleason show. And when I saw him perform there, and never realized that one of his assistants would become my best friend, George Goebel, who owns A.T. Jones Costume Shop.
Okay.
And George became one of the top stage illusionists, especially here in the state of Maryland, but on the East Coast. And it did a fabulous show with about 20, 30 assistants.
Wow.
Actually, it was like 2 tractor trailers of equipment that he traveled with, but never realizing when I saw him that later on in life we would become best friends.
That's really cool.
Yeah. But as a kid, I had this. I loved magic, and I remember that I was always taking notes. I don't know why, but I was always writing stuff down. And the good part of it is I kept the stuff, and I kept papers for years. I guess I was a hoarder before the word existed, And but I remember I would get magic at Christmas time, and but when I was into magic and out of magic, into magic, out of it, and then while I was in high school, magic really wasn't considered to be cool back then. This is before Doug Henning came onto the scene in the early '70s. But in high school, as I was graduating, I said, as soon as I get out of high school, I'm actually going to get back into magic. And that's exactly what I did. And I just started to develop different types of shows. I did stage illusions at one time. And I had, but I was always, had a heart for doing children's entertainment. So
Okay.
I started to do that in the early '70s and really never really stopped with that.
Now, you have studied and you actually, I guess the best word is collect information on magic history.
Correct. Right.
Now, I believe it was you who told me a couple years ago that Baltimore was a hub for magic.
Oh, definitely.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it's not widely known nowadays. When people think magic, they think Las Vegas.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, it was in the late 1700s that magicians were coming to Baltimore to perform. And there was a performer, and we'll talk about him a little bit later, that was one of the first magicians to perform in a theater.
Wow.
Back then. But there were others, and they performed on the street and actually in taverns.
Okay.
And there was a gentleman, it might be Bailey, I can't recall the name offhand, but he actually performed at all these taverns at probably, I think it was 1750, 1760, and that's recorded in these colonial newspapers that are on file. And but the one performer actually performed in Fells Point, and performing sleight of hand. He was a conjurer. But there was also, they did a form of Punch and Judy. It was a Punchinello, but it was done with marionettes.
Huh.
So, yeah.
So
how did we get from there to whatever? Or
well, yes, but actually the thing I want to point out, so what you're saying is that people have been performing magic in Maryland since before we were a country.
Yes.
Wow.
But they weren't necessarily local magicians.
Right. Okay.
They were just wandering conjurers that came in and performed. And that would happen anywhere at that point,
So what made Baltimore a hub for magic?
Sure. That started in, believe it or not, in 1908.
Okay.
Why do we say that? Okay, I think it was in May of 1908. There was a famous magician named Harry Keller.
Okay.
And he was a top, one of America's top stage illusionists, like David Copperfield would be today. Well, that was Harry Keller back then. And in 1908, he came to Ford's Grand Opera House, and he was going to retire.
Okay.
And he named his successor there. And his successor was Howard Thurston, who was a magician. That's his poster right in back of us, right? And so he named, and it was at that moment when that happened, Baltimore started to be referred to as a magic city.
Wow. So Thurston lived in Baltimore?
No.
It was just the fact that this was
that
done.
event happened here.
Okay.
Right. And then from there, other magic clubs started to form. I can list some of the other names as we talk, but there was these early clubs, and one of the earlier clubs, it was called the Demons Club of Baltimore, or Demons Club of Baltimore Magicians was the title, and it was founded by a magician named Arthur D. Gans. And what happened is when they formed, when Thurston would come into town with his stage show, they would hold these banquets for him, and they would honor him when he came into town. And there became this connection then between him and the Demons Club.
Okay.
So the Demons Club were actually one of the only one club that I know of in this state that had its own clubhouse. And it was, what was it? It was a bungalow of some sort, a one giant room, and it was near a railroad station.
Okay.
And we have pictures of that that we could show, and we have pictures on the inside. But they had their own clubhouse for many years, and it was kind of unique at that time, you know. And but inside they had a small stage. They had pictures of, I think on each side of the stage there was a giant picture of Howard Thurston and one of Harry Keller. See, they honored them.
Yeah.
And they had many magicians that would come to the clubhouse, and Houdini was one of them.
Really?
He was definitely one of them. Bill Neff, Harry Blackstone Sr. was a famous magician. I think it was Okido, another famous magician. But all these magicians came to the clubhouse. But once a year, they had these banquets in honor. Howard Thurston just idolized the members of the Demons Club.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and he would donate things to them. And matter of fact, he would say there was like 3 days when that he looked forward to. One was when he would join up with his daughter, you know, and so I forget the second one, but the third one was when I came to Baltimore and to visit with the Demons Club members. Yeah.
And I take it the Demons Club had their bungalow before like the Magic Castle was around, and
I do believe so. Yes. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that's not to say that there weren't other clubs and so forth. And that was a big thing. I mean, years later, what would happen is that the Demons Club, they sold the clubhouse. A lot of the items that were in the Demons Club, I believe Phil Thomas of the Yogi Magic Mart, they went to his magic shop. And again, they sold the clubhouse. And then the Demons Club merged and became part of the Society of American Magicians,
okay.
a local chapter, you know. So, so that's what happened with them. Now, it was interesting because with the Demons Club, there was a member by the name of Thomas Chew Worthington III. And Thomas Worthington, his name may mean nothing to you, but he had this obsession with magic. And it was a good thing that he did, because a lot of things exist today that maybe wouldn't have existed had it not been for him. But he was a little disenchanted with the Demons Club, because he felt that they were allowing in a lot of members that weren't magicians.
Okay.
And he was irritated by that. So they broke off, him and other members, and created their own group that became known as the Society of Osiris.
Okay.
And they had a very tough membership initiation to get into the group. And Howard Thurston, Worthington was best friends with Howard Thurston.
Okay.
And he showed him the application, and Howard Thurston thought that it was too difficult. Now, he said that, but they didn't change it. So it's just like if you couldn't pass this rigid test, you couldn't become a member of their group.
Wow. And they're still around, I believe.
Yes, and I'm actually a member of that.
Okay.
Yeah. So what happened is that the club never ended, and that it was incorporated for many years. And one of the members was George Goebel.
Okay.
So George kept it alive, and that's how I became a member. There's only about 6 or 7 of us now, you know. But now we used to meet, but some of our members aren't in the best of health, so
Okay.
we don't meet as much as we used to. But we produced our own magic newsletter, and that
Wow.
was filled. And matter of fact, it was filled with magic history related to Baltimore and so forth, you know. Now, the one interesting thing about Worthington is that, again, he was different, and the good part of it is that he was a magic collector. He was almost, in some ways, you might think of him as being, again, he had this obsession with magic, so he started to accumulate all this stuff. And he started collecting magic posters
Okay.
and props. And he would write to anybody. And he was getting props from all these different magicians. And because of Howard Thurston would give him stuff. He knew Keller would give him things. So he had this huge collection of magic. And it was his dream to create a museum of magic. Now, you got to remember this. I mean, this is like years ago, you know. And so he had talked to a couple other people, and you know, they were going to try to work this out. But what happened is his health wasn't that good, and he wound up donating all this stuff that went to the Ringland Circus Museum in Florida, and he had letters from them saying that they were going to build this museum, but it never happened. Okay, so and eventually he just died, and all this stuff was there. It was a huge collection of magic artifacts. So it sat there for many years, and then what happened is that other magic collectors came on, you know, to the scene. They said, wait a minute, didn't he send this magic down there? So they went after it. So it sort of got divided up into a couple collections.
Okay.
There was a magician named David Price who was in Tennessee. I actually visited with him, a real nice guy. And he had his own museum called the Egyptian Hall Museum of Magic. And or Egyptian Hall, yeah, I forget the title, but it's something like that. So he acquired a large part of it, but there was also a magician, I happen to know him, Ken Klosterman, and he's in the baking industry. He's like the John Padarakis of Baltimore. That's how he is up in the Ohio area.
Okay.
And he acquired a large section of this. Now, some of the stuff was still here in Baltimore because of the Society of Osiris. So my friend George Goebel has part of it. So interesting, a couple years ago, David Price of the Egyptian Hall Museum came to Baltimore, and our group, the Society of Osiris, had a magic, we hosted the Magic Collectors Association. They would hold a convention. So our group decided that we would host it, and we did, and it was up in the Hunt Valley area. And 250 magicians from around the world came to this. And the whole emphasis of that convention was centered on the history of magic in Baltimore.
Really?
Yeah, that's true. and we had people I gave a talk about magic in Baltimore. McCall Roberts gave a talk about Dantini, and we had somebody talk about Phil Thomas and so forth. But while we were there, David Price he wasn't in very good health, but his son came there, and I knew his son from the time that I had visited, and he came to the convention and talked to two of my friends, George Daly from Pennsylvania, and Mike Caveney, who's from Pasadena, California, and both of them are noted magic collectors and historians.
Okay.
And David Price's son wound up selling the Egyptian Hall Museum to them.
Wow.
So they bought it, and they're both magic history collectors and so forth. So they kept a large part of the collection, and then they sold off the rest of it.
Okay.
Mike Caveney and George Daly, they loved posters, but there were a lot of duplicates. So they sold off the duplicates, and they had this huge auction that went on for a couple days, and magicians from all around came in and bought the duplicate posters and so forth.
Well, it seems to me like it's almost a weird kind of fine line with the history of magic and preserving it is that, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a lot of collectors who collect the history of magic. They collect the apparatuses, they collect the props, but I don't see them widely then put out for people to see. Like, there's not a lot, or at least there's not a lot of noted magic museums that are just known around, like there's no like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame of magic.
Right.
And it seems like from things that I've read and seen that a lot of these artifacts of magic history go into private collections as opposed to being shown to the world. Is that right?
To a degree. I mean, there is the American Museum of Magic in Michigan.
Okay.
Okay, and people could go into there. David Copperfield has a huge, huge collection of magic. He has a museum of magic.
Okay, so he does have a museum.
He has a museum, but it's not necessarily open to the general public.
Okay.
So that's what happens, And a lot of the guys, I mean, they have these things, and they're very, I mean, if you're a magician and they feel that you are sincere and you want to do research, they'll bend over backwards to help you with that. It's magicians helping other magicians.
And that's what I mean with the double or the fine line is you have to be, you almost have to be in the business or in the know of being a magician, being interested in magic, and having a bit of knowledge before you can go and see some of this stuff.
Yeah, everybody has to pay their dues. And I remember, when I was working on my book about ghost shows, but I had another book out, see, so they knew that I had sort of paid my dues in there, and I was a member of the Magic Collectors Association, and I knew some of the members, and the members talked to other members, and so I was able to visit, the American Museum of Magic. David Price, went to visit him because he heard about me, I had written to him, and he had my other book, and so it's like that's what kind of happens, and so magicians try to help other magicians, especially when it comes to magic history.
Okay.
They want to make sure it keeps going. So.
Now, do you have any? And this is kind of off the subject of Baltimore, but we were talking before this interview, just you and me, about how a lot of books on magic are limited press. Mm-hmm. Do you have any recommendations for somebody who might not necessarily be a magician but is into the history of magic to be able to learn more about it, that is something that is out there that they can acquire easily, I should say?
A particular book?
Yeah.
That's a tough one. You know, it's sort of like magicians will spend a lifetime working on one particular book on a particular subject.
Okay.
And that's how it goes. I mean, a friend of mine, in a couple weeks we're going to Boston, and it's a group called NEMCA, which is the New England Magic Collectors Association.
Okay.
Now they meet every other year, so I'm going to it this year. And a friend of mine, Tom Ewing, is releasing a book about McDonald Birch, who performed magic. So it's a whole book just on him, touring and everything else. A lot of the magicians have written books on Houdini. I mean, it's umpteen books on Houdini,
Yes.
and everybody takes a different slant on that, And some people have written it on this magician, that Howard Thurston, Houdini, whatever, So it's kind of hard to pinpoint a particular book, But there are a couple magic organizations, like I said, the Magic Collectors Association is out there. NEMCA meets every other year. And in between that, so they don't cross, there's another group out in California.
Okay.
And they have the Conference on Magic History. So a lot of magicians go to there as well. So they one year they're in California, next year they're up in the Boston area, and back and forth. But a lot of magicians are the same magicians going to the same conventions, and it's interesting. That's all I could say. And you would think it would be boring, but I can tell you it's not. It's sometimes the things you learn and the things you see, it's mind-boggling. So
I can imagine. Well, I can't completely imagine, but I've been interested in magic my whole life, and I'm always constantly amazed by things that I learn. And with something as entertaining as magic, I can't imagine that it would ever get boring.
But there's always discoveries where somebody will discover something, or they'll resurrect a lost illusion that hasn't been seen in years, and they'll demonstrate that. And usually at these events they'll have entertainment as well. So it's not like it's lecture. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's at NEMCA they'll have a Saturday evening of entertainment with a couple performers. Some magicians just sit back and just have a good time, But it's a real friendly group. I mean, everybody kind of knows one another, and again, there's always new members popping up, and they accept them, and it's kind of good to recruit some new members, because it's a lot of the magic collectors are older gentlemen, and they get some new lifeblood into it. That's a good thing,
Obviously, nowadays people don't think of Baltimore, or the general public doesn't think of Baltimore as a magic hub.
That's correct.
What led to the decline of Baltimore being a magic center?
That's a tough one. I don't know if I have a general answer on that. Well, I mean, again, you had the two big magic organizations that were here, and the one merged with the Society of American Magicians, and that just became like a local chapter. So they didn't have their clubhouse. And a lot of the magic, remember, that was here between Worthington and so forth, that left. Went to the Circus Museum. We had another famous magician, very famous magician. Actually, there were two. And one was Dr. Henry Ridgely Evans. And he was a journalist, and was very well known for his writings about magic history. He wrote for the International Brotherhood of Magicians. So you had him there writing about this. And actually, he was one of the earlier magic historians in the United States, writing about magic. And his books, even today, they're highly collectible and sought after because of his writings. He was one of the premier magic historians. And we were lucky that there was another one, and his name was Milburn Christopher. And actually grew up not that far from where he lived. He lived on Patterson Park Avenue. And I grew up in East Baltimore, so I could have walked. Let me just say that. Christopher, his whole life was dedicated to magic. Was one of the few magicians that made a living performing magic and writing about magic. His books were picked up by popular press companies and so forth, publishers. And out there, he wrote several books on Houdini, and he had a huge magic collection. And he died a few years back, and then that was his collection was basically sold off. That's what happened.
Wow.
So let's face it. You had at that time you had these magic organizations, all this magic here, everything's going on, and now the Worthington collection leaves. Christopher's no longer out there, and so it just it's
just kind of fizzled out.
Fizzled out, And then again too, we had the Yogi Magic Mart, which was one of the best magic shops ever. I mean, here in the United States. I mean, it was one of the top. It was a fantastic magic shop. And then when Phil basically retired, he sold it out. And then there was a fire, and that destroyed a lot of the stuff. Phil resurrected the shop for a few years, and then it was bought by a gentleman named Paul Woolman, who owns P.W. Feats.
Okay. And
then they moved it to Ellicott City, right on Main Street. And then there was an arsonist came into the store. He wanted to use the bathroom or restroom. It was downstairs in the basement. He went downstairs and lit some stuff on fire. But they didn't discover it and then the fire burned through the shop.
Oh, man.
The fire department came to put it out, and they did, but when they left, it started back up again and destroyed, I think it was 3 or 4 of the main buildings on Main Street.
Wow.
Yeah, that was terrible. So you're losing material a little bit here and there, you know what I mean? So it's
Now, you talked about the ghost shows. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about what are ghost shows? That's something that we don't have nowadays.
Oh, that's my specialty. Well, it was a form of entertainment that really came into being around 1930, 1932. And what happened was, it was out during the late 1800s, the turn of the century, the 1900s. There was a big growth in spiritualism. People were trying to make contact with the dead, and there were readings and seances and so forth. It's kind of hard to believe, but that's what was happening,
Well, no, it's still actually, they have conventions nowadays. They're pretty big. Right. They have a lot of conventions for like tarot readings and things like that.
But even during Houdini's, the latter part of his life was after his mom died, he was devoted his life to making contact with her and exposing these fraudulent mediums. That's what he did. So again, there was all this stuff going on. So what I believe happened is that there were magicians out there, and I know this is true because I did the research. So they started to put these certain effects into their shows, where maybe they would float a table, that kind of, or they had a spirit cabinet. They would do that. They would show this thing empty, and next thing a ghost sort of appeared. So they would do that. Then some of them, what they did is that if a performer, say like Harry Blackstone, Harry Blackstone Sr., he was in town for a whole week. Well, he would advertise, now, don't forget, come back on Saturday night. We're going to do a special show for you. So it was a way to get people to come back. And then on some of these, they would advertise it as a spook show or a ghost show. And Howard Thurston did it. Harry Blackstone did it. They would have a special night. You would come in, and they would perform maybe some of the same magic tricks you saw, but they had like this ghostly theme to it.
Okay.
Again, a spirit cabinet, a dancing handkerchief, a floating light bulb, but they would do that, add a couple other effects into it. Well, there was a performer, his name was Elwyn Peck, and he was from Salt Lake City. And he wasn't necessarily a magician, but he did mind reading and so forth. So he started to do the same thing, where he would be at a theater, do these readings, and they would come in to the show Saturday night, and we're going to have a ghost show is what happened. So some of the performers, they started to use luminous paint, glow-in-the-dark paint, and they would take pieces of cheesecloth and paint it or whatever, so the lights would go out, and it would look like at the end like these ghosts appeared. And I believe anyway, that Elwyn finally figured it out that they had a big turnout to see this show. And from what I've heard is that finally he said, I'll work at your theater for free during the week if I get the receipts for the Saturday night ghost show. He started to make a lot of money.
Wow.
And his idea was, why do it one night? We're going to do it 7 days a week.
Okay.
So they would. The idea was, and he, as far as I know, he was the one that came up with it. When you play in a theater, after it legitimately closes, whatever else you bring in is extra at that point. So that's what he did. His show was going to start at midnight.
Okay.
As a movie theater operator, you just did your regular business. Normally that would be it, but now we're going to bring in extra revenue you never thought existed. And he would come in. Now his show was really, I knew people, well, Milburn Christopher saw it, and he said the accent of the show was more on phantoms.
Okay.
So you would come into his show and he would have he would get somebody from the audience, show a pair of slates, nothing on there, put them together. They would hold it, the slates would shake, you would remove them, and there would be a message there, And then he would have like a dancing handkerchief and do this. But what the key for his show was, again, at the end, they would turn out the lights and ghosts would appear. And they wouldn't just appear like on stage, they would actually appear out in the audience as well. And they did a phenomenal business with that. And then he decided, we're going to take this thing on a major tour. So for about 3 years, I think it was about 3 years, they toured all over, even up into Canada with it. And they were doing, unbelievable numbers. And at that point, what happened is, magicians being magicians, they're making money doing this. Why don't we do it as well? And that's what happened.
Okay.
So others just jumped on the bandwagon, and somebody else would come along and add stuff, and there were some really well-known performers. There was a performer named Jack Baker. He was from Toledo, Ohio. I actually went to Toledo to meet him. He had a show called The Asylum of Horrors, and he was the first one to introduce the Frankenstein monster to his show. And when he added that to his show, he went gangbusters.
Wow.
Because Frankenstein was the man back then. And now he never had permission to do that either. Okay. But he moved around so much. They were always trying to, the Universal Studios was chasing after him, but they never could find him. Eventually, they did catch up with him. They brought him to court, and he said, let me present my show to you. And he did, but he lost the case. But what Universal said is, if you want, we'll license the character to you.
Okay.
And they did that, But at one time, it was either, I don't have my notes in front of me, 5 or 7 different units of his show traveling throughout the United States at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And sadly, I guess you could say I don't know if desensitized is the right word, but I don't think a show like that would necessarily work as well nowadays.
It would work in a theatrical setting. Now, there's a magician named David Cboc who's out in the Milwaukee area. Now, he does the show around Halloween every year.
Okay.
And again, it's done in a theater. You're probably paying, I don't know what you're paying, $30 a ticket.
Yeah.
So you're getting the right element to come in to see the show. Now, a couple of years ago, Teller of Penn and Teller created a show called Play Dead. Now, I never saw it, but it was, I think it was an off-Broadway show. It was it was a play, is basically what it was, and all this stuff happened. But at the end of the show, they turned out all the lights, and ghosts would appear.
Oh, wow.
So they used the same elements of the ghost show, but again, they're able to work it out through being done through a play. Teller actually visited me several times. We had dinner at the house and so forth. And he was a huge fan of my book.
Really?
A huge fan, yeah. And actually, he wrote a little thing that was used on the dust jacket of the second edition of the book. Okay. Yeah.
Now, is there anybody in Baltimore now that is, I guess you can say, making the rounds as a magician, becoming a local, not necessarily Dantini, because Dantini was Dantini, but is there anybody of note in Baltimore?
I actually can't think of anybody, you know. There's a lot of magicians out there, and they're working all the time, you know. A lot of times you never hear about them, but, I mean, they're out there, and I knew a magician named Charlie Reynolds, and he was a noted magic historian and a collector. And I actually interviewed him and did a story about him, but and he lived in New York. He was a consultant for Doug Henning and also Harry Blackstone Sr. I mean, excuse me, Harry Blackstone Jr. And he said the thing about magic. He said, magic will never be at the top of the show business. He goes, that's more or less the singers and the dancers, or maybe the comedians. He goes, but magic is like the circus. He says, it will always be there. And I thought, well, what a great way to sum it all up,
Yeah.
you know.